Hello, today we're going to talk about energy subsidies, and I have prepared a rather ambitious PowerPoint presentation, and I'm not someone who tends to read off of the PowerPoint slides, so what I'm going to do is to refer you to the slides, which I'll put in our learning management system, and there's a lot of notes that you can look at as we go through. But essentially, we're talking about energy subsidies, which have a long and storied past. And a subsidy is essentially the money that the government gives to the industry, whether it's coal, oil, gas, geothermal, what have you, to subsidize their work, and that is believed to be in the public interest. There are lots of subsidies in the agricultural industry as well. And there are three agents that are associated with this. First, technology, driving innovation. How can we do this better or more cheaply? Then authorities, how can we provide energy to consumers in a way that is steady and has a large supply? And then consumers. Consumers will, for example, make the decision about whether to buy an electric vehicle and drive to work and save a lot of energy and also potentially lower climate change gases by incentivizing the consumer on his or her choices, their choices. So these fall into a number of different categories in terms of the subsidies, and these are words right from the World Trade Organization. So the government can give cash subsidies, the government can give tax concessions, so credits or deferrals. There are some things that have been going on for a really long time. For example, in the Korean War, there were subsidies and plans put in to make sure that everybody had energy, and we're still using them. So these things, sadly, that are temporary become permanent. 2009, there was a stimulus package that was put in, and we're still using aspects of that. So you see that, these things are starting to pile on top of each other and leading to, as we'll see, an enormous amount of subsidizing of fossil fuels. So then you can also have government procurement. So you pay a higher amount than the market rate, and then the government owns that, whether it's agriculture or, in this case, fossil fuels. And then stock, purchasing stock from the organization. The government does it to keep the price high. This is a graph of fossil fuel subsidies in the United States. And on the low thing here, this is pre-tax subsidies. So those are on the decline. Pre-tax subsidies, this is as percent of global GDP, so enormous. And then we have post-tax subsidies here, and then as a percent of the global GDP. You see that in 2017, we're on this uptick in terms of subsidies of the post-tax, which is a better way to go for the companies. Sadly, we also subsidize globally so that last graph, I'm sorry, it was global. The subsidies go to renewables. And this is a picture of renewable energy. And the brown here is China, United States, Europe, and then the rest of the world is the light blue. And so what you can see is that even though the subsidies are on the rise for fossil fuels, they are on the decline for the renewables that we've been talking about in our class. This is bad news because, as you know, we do the cheapest thing. The way that the fossil fuel dollars break down, this is in billions of dollars, and you see that the oil price is the most subsidized. Coal right now is the least. So we should be angry about this. Excuse me, as we try to move to net zero, as we try to move towards a carbon-free future, we are hindered by these subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. The reports that are coming out from various agencies say that if we want to stop climate change, the worst impacts of climate change, we have to be net zero by 2050. That's not that far in the future. And can we do that when we have subsidies that are $5.2 trillion in subsidies globally for fossil fuels? That it's about 6.5% of the global GDP going right to subsidies to make fossil fuels really cheap. So this is production, and you can see in this graph, production, this is up to 2019, and then after, so this is up to 2019, we are mining more and more. Coal's on the decline, but natural gas, crude oil, and hydrocarbons, so that is LNG sort of things, is on the rise. It is a question of money, not technology, not the best way of doing things for people or from a human point of view, but it's simply what the cheapest thing is. So we have this climate assessment that has gone on globally as well as in the United States. And I won't read this to you, but essentially, it's not open to debate anymore. We are radically impairing our ability to live on this earth. And it's costing us an enormous amount of money in terms of hurricane damage, as I showed you in my recent paper, and droughts, wildfires, all the natural disasters are on the rise. And we are having to pay the price for that, reverse flooding. So we have this situation. We also have a situation right now where our current administration is defunding things that promote climate change solutions and essentially says that it is a hoax. So I don't mean to just do the con side. That was to kind of tell you what the subsidies are. And so there are pros. Think about it. I mean, just logically, pros are that we're supplying unlimited for you energy very cheaply. Do you want the price of your electric bill to rise? Do you want the price of your heating bill to rise? These prices would rise if we withdraw subsidies. So this is the price that you pay for energy, whether it's gas or electricity, being highly subsidized by the government. So here's carbon capture and storage. There are some tax breaks for that. Renewable energy, we're at 12.2 billion, and 16.8 for corn ethanol, which is a debacle. This is awful. This is in the United States. For reasons that we can discuss, you have monocrops, row crops competing with food for fuel, and it's just not the way to do it. But we have these subsidies that are put in place that you can essentially have double duty for agricultural subsidies and for fuel subsidies using corn to turn it into ethanol. We talked about that in biomass. And then you see here fossil fuels, $70.2 billion for fossil fuels. It's eclipsing the other types of subsidies that would go towards a greener future. Here's an example of a subsidy, consumer rebate rather, for an electric vehicle. And there was a lot of money going into this. They're ending now and have ended, but you could get $2,500 credit for any of the below vehicle types. And this is June 2014 through November 2018. And you see that there were a lot of rebates issued. So that cleans our environment and does a good thing. It levelizes the playing field, essentially. So renewables still need subsidies because of the levelized cost of energy, so that they will be on par with fossil fuels. You're leveling the playing field if you subsidize the renewables, and this is part of the subsidies. It drives innovation. If you subsidize innovation and actual implementation of renewables, it compensates for the lasting problem of infrastructure, the grid being set up for fossil fuels, and it will essentially close the gap between the cost of fossil fuels versus renewables. There are some bad things, and there's a lot of stuff that I put in the notes for here, the historical perspective of the fossil fuel subsidies going back to when British ships were bringing coal here, sort of putting money into the very ships that the coal was bringing here, so it would make it cheap. So they are very, very old, and they come in a lot of different forms. You can read this picture right here in terms of what sort of subsidies that are there. They are an intrinsic part of our economic system in the country as well as globally. And there are a lot of outdated ones that are layered on top of new ones, and that are layered on new ones. And you see that the subsidies here, again, oil and gas versus nuclear, biofuels, this is corn ethanol, this is not good, not the way to go. And then renewables are just dwarfed. Another way of looking at this is global fossil fuel subsidies versus US clean energy subsidies versus European clean energy subsidies, the purple, versus the rest of the world clean energy subsidies. So that data is a little old, but you can see that the trend doesn't change. So subsidies are global. Here's another chart showing pollution is a component of the subsidies. So we are subsidizing the wrong thing, essentially. We are causing the fossil fuels that we're using to be underpriced. Therefore, we keep using them, and we have increased demand because it's so cheap. Right now, we're in a situation where the price of oil and gas is ridiculously low, which we'll get into later. So the trend in energy subsidies, again, this is another picture of the same thing. Let me move this, is that we are disproportionately subsidizing the wrong things. There are 12 types of credits that go into fossil fuel extraction, and this gets to the heart of the kind of layering that goes on. And you see that there are all sorts of subsidies that were intended to be temporary, long periods of time ago in things like exploration and manufacturing, and then you actually get money. This is awful. So if you own some land and you say, I'm going to drill on this in the future, then you get a subsidy. You don't even have to do anything. And then as you start to drill from your land, the government says, is worth less than it was because you've pulled your oil and gas out. So you get to have a subsidy for your land being worth less than it was before. And so again, you can read the notes field of this PowerPoint presentation, and you can see the more clear descriptions of all of these, but this is a lot of layering on. The social implications, it's important to think about the social justice aspect of fossil fuels, and this is just a really, really bad way to support those who are lower income. You know, if you get your gas bill, you can offer to pay more, and that will subsidize lower income households. Most of the benefits that are coming out of these subsidies that go directly to the consumers are given to the rich households, big, huge houses, McMansions, and then also to landlords who get the money for the subsidies. So you can see that only 8% of the subsidies go to the poorest fifth of the population. And that's even worse when you go to globally. 7% of fuel subsidies go to the bottom 20% of the households, and almost half end up in the richest 20%. So this is not the right way to do things from a social justice point of view. From an environmental point of view, you know, we could really subsidize things that will go well for the future. This cartoon, interesting, is that, when we subsidize the fossil fuels, it's designed to make energy cheap. And then when we're doing renewables, it's designed to make local pollution go away a little more. But there is exploitation that goes on globally, and the increased demand for energy that we all have for our phones, for our devices, for air conditioning as it gets hotter out, is going to go, if the trend continue towards the polluting fossil fuel, and including nuclear in here. So remember, we use nuclear under the traditional types of non-renewable energy. So nuclear goes in here. We have a huge amount of subsidy that goes into the nuclear realm, and it ruined the environment. Deepwater Horizon, that was a film. If you haven't seen it, it's a good one to watch. And it is catastrophic for reasons that we have talked about and will continue to talk about to the environment. So again, continuing on with the cons, right now, alternatives can't compete with fossil fuels because of the subsidies. It's not that they're a worse form of energy, though there are stumbling blocks, but we cannot compete with fossil fuels with the renewables. And it has to be the case that we are driving innovation in renewables and shifting away from fossil fuels so that we can have a clean environment. So I will leave it to you to make your own educated decision based on the research that you do and this kind of brief discussion of subsidies. And the pros are that we need subsidies because they make our energy cheap and readily available. When you subsidize the renewables, they can speed up the rate of adoption because they become cheaper and they can lower production costs. The cons are that they hinder energy efficiency across the board. If you have really cheap wind energy, you're going to use more. So they hinder energy efficiency and they hide positive behavioral changes associated with renewables and with using less energy efficiency. When they're in the fossil fuel industry, they're terrific at hiding externalities. And we went into that in our first class. And they impede any sort of investment in renewable energy because the ones that are in place are tending to stay in place. So the question for you this week, as you're grappling with this, is what should we do? And it's not enough to make the blanket statement that I'm frequently stating, which is take away the subsidies from the oil and gas industry and shift them into the renewable realm. What does that look like? We have to go a little deeper and we have to think about what are the types of subsidies that we want to take out of the fossil fuel industries and how do we want to put them into the renewables. So this is something that we will be grappling with this week, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say about this and what you have to say about subsidies in general. So onward to your work.